Scientific Racism and the Emergence of the Homosexual Body by Siobhan Somerville. One of the most important insights developed in the fields of lesbian and gay history and the history of sexuality has been the notion that homosexuality and, by extension, heterosexuality are relatively recent inventions in Western culture, rather than transhistorical or natural categories of human beings. As Michel Foucault and other historians of sexuality have argued, although sexual acts between two people of the same sex had been punishable through legal and religious sanctions well before the late 19th century, 1800s, they did not necessarily define individuals as homosexual per se. Only recently, in the late 19th century, 1800s, did a new understanding of sexuality emerge, in which sexual acts and desires became constitutive of identity. Homosexuality as the condition, and therefore identity, of particular bodies is thus a production of that historical moment. Medical literature, broadly defined to include the writings of physicians, sexologists, and psychiatrists, has been integral to this historical argument. Although medical discourse was by no means the only, nor necessarily the most powerful, site of the emergence of new sexual identities, it does nevertheless offer rich sources for at least partially understanding the complex development of these categories in the late 19th, 1800s, and early 20th, 1900s centuries. Medical and sexological literature not only became one of the few sites of explicit engagement with questions of sexuality during this period, but also held substantial definitional power within a culture that sanctioned science to discover and tell the truth about bodies. As historians and theorists of sexuality have refined a notion of the late 19th century, 1800s, invention of the homosexual, their discussions have drawn primarily upon theories and histories of gender. George Chauncey, in particular, has provided an invaluable discussion of the ways in which paradigms of sexuality shifted according to changing ideologies of gender during this period. He notes a gradual change in medical models of sexual deviance from a notion of sexual inversion, understood as a reversal of one's sex role, to a model of homosexuality, defined as deviant sexual object choice. These categories and their transformations, argues Chauncey, reflected concurrent shifts in the cultural organization of sex-gender roles and participated in prescribing acceptable behavior, especially within a context of white middle-class gender ideologies. While gender insubordination offers a powerful explanatory model for the invention of homosexuality, ideologies of gender also, of course, shaped and were shaped by dominant constructions of race. Indeed, although it has received little acknowledgement, it is striking that the invention of the homosexual occurred at roughly the same time that racial questions were being reformulated, particularly in the United States. This was the moment, for instance, of Plessy versus Ferguson, the 1896 U.S. Supreme Court ruling that insisted that black and white races were separate but equal, both a product of and a stimulus to a nationwide and brutal era of racial segregation. This ruling had profound and lasting effects in legitimating an apartheid structure that remained legally sanctioned for over half of the 20th century, 1900s. The Plessy case distilled in legal form many widespread contemporary fears about race and racial difference at the time. A deluge of Jim Crow and anti-miscegenation laws, combined with unprecedented levels of racial violence, most visibly manifested in widespread lynching, reflected an aggressive attempt to classify and separate bodies as either black or white. Is it merely a historical coincidence that the classification of bodies as either homosexual or heterosexual emerged at the same time that the United States was aggressively policing the imaginary boundary between black and white bodies? Although some historians of sexuality have included brief acknowledgement of 19th century 1800s discourses of racial difference, the particular relationship and potentially mutual effects of discourses of homosexuality and race remain unexplored. This silence around race may be due in part to the relative lack of explicit attention to race in medical and sexological literature of the period. These writers did not self-consciously interrogate race, nor were those whose gender insubordination and sexual transgression brought them under the medical gaze generally identified by race in these accounts. Yet the lack of explicit attention to race in these texts does not mean that it was irrelevant to sexologists' endeavors. Given the upheaval surrounding racial definition during this period, it is reasonable to imagine that these texts were as embedded within contemporary racial ideologies as they were within ideologies of gender. Take, for instance, the words of Havelock Ellis, whose massive studies in the psychology of sex was one of the most important texts of the late 19th century, 1800s, medical and scientific discourse on sexuality. "I regard sex as the central problem of life," began the general preface to the first volume. Justifying such unprecedented boldness toward the study of sex, Ellis explained, "And now that the problem of religion has practically been settled, and that the problem of labor has at least been placed on a practical foundation, the question of sex, with the racial questions that rest on it, stands before the coming generations as the chief problem for solution." Despite Ellis's oddly breezy dismissal of the problems of labor and religion, which were far from settled at the time, this passage points suggestively to a link between sexual and racial anxieties. Yet what exactly did Ellis mean by racial questions? More significantly, what was his sense of the relationship between racial questions and the question of sex? Although Ellis himself left these issues unresolved, his elliptical declaration nevertheless suggested that a discourse of race, however elusively, somehow hovered around or within the study of sexuality. In this article, I offer speculations on how late 19th, 1800s, and early 20th, 1900s, century discourses of race and sexuality might be not merely juxtaposed, but brought together in ways that illuminate both. I suggest that the concurrent bifurcations of categories of race and sexuality were not only historically coincident, but in fact structurally interdependent and perhaps mutually productive. My goal, however, is not to garner and display unequivocal evidence of the direct influence of racial categories on those who were developing scientific models of homosexuality, nor am I interested in identifying individual writers and thinkers as racist or not. Rather, my focus here is on racial ideologies, the cultural assumptions and systems of representation about race through which individuals understood their relationships within the world. My emphasis lies in understanding the relationships between the medical, scientific discourse around sexuality and the dominant scientific discourse around race during this period, that is, scientific racism. My approach combines literary and historical methods of reading, particularly those that have been so crucial to lesbian and gay studies, the technique of reading to hear the inexplicable presence of the thing not named, of being attuned to the queer presences and implications in texts that do not otherwise name them. Without this collective project to see, hear, and confirm queer inflections where others would deny their existence, it is arguable that gay and lesbian studies itself, and particularly our knowledge and understanding of the histories, writing, and cultures of lesbians and gay men, would be impoverished, if not impossible. In a similar way, I propose to use the techniques of queer reading, but to modulate my analysis from a focus of sexuality and gender to one alert to racial resonances as well. My attention, then, is focused on the racial pressure points in exemplary texts from the late 19th century, 1800s, discourse on sexuality, including those written by Ellis and other writers of the period who made explicit references to homosexuality. I suggest that the structures and methodologies that drove dominant ideologies of race also fueled the pursuit of scientific knowledge about the homosexual body. Both sympathetic and hostile accounts of homosexuality were steeped in assumptions that had driven previous scientific studies of race. My aim is not to replace a focus on gender and sexuality with that of race, but rather to understand how discourses of race and gender buttress one another, often competing, often overlapping, in shaping emergent models of homosexuality. I suggest three broadly defined ways in which discourses of sexuality seem to have been particularly engaged, sometimes overtly, but largely implicitly, with the discourse of scientific racism. All of these models pathologized both the non-white body and the non-heterosexual body to greater or lesser extents. Although I discuss these models in separate sections here, they often coexisted, despite their contradictions. These models are speculative and are intended as a first step toward understanding the myriad and historically specific ways that racial and sexual discourses shaped each other at the moment that homosexuality entered scientific discourse. Visible differences, sexology, and comparative anatomy. Ellis's Sexual Inversion, the first volume of Studies in the Psychology of Sex to be published, became a definitive text in late 19th century 1800s investigations of homosexuality. Despite the series' titular focus on the psychology of sex, Sexual Inversion was a hybrid text, poised in methodology between the earlier field of comparative anatomy, with its procedures of bodily measurement, and the nascent techniques of psychology, with its focus on mental development. In Sexual Inversion, Ellis hoped to provide scientific authority for the position that homosexuality should be considered not a crime but rather a congenital, and thus involuntary, physiological abnormality. Writing Sexual Inversion in the wake of England's 1885 Labouchere Amendment, which prohibited any act of gross indecency between men, Ellis intended in large part to defend homosexuality from law and public opinion, which, in his view, combined to place a heavy penal burden and a severe social stigma on the manifestations of an instinct, which to those persons who possess it frequently appears natural and normal. In doing so, Ellis attempted to drape himself in the cultural authority of a naturalist, eager to exert his powers of observation, in an attempt to classify and codify understandings of homosexuality. Like other sexologists, Ellis assumed that the invert might be visually distinguishable from the normal body through anatomical markers, just as the differences between the sexes had traditionally been mapped upon the body. Yet the study of sexual difference was not the only methodological precedent for the study of the homosexual body. In its assumptions about somatic differences, I suggest, Sexual Inversion also drew upon and participated in a history of the scientific investigation of race. Race, in fact, became an explicit, though ambiguous, structural element in Ellis's Sexual Inversion. In Chapter 5, titled The Nature of Sexual Inversion, Ellis attempted to collate the evidence contained in his collection of case studies, dividing his general conclusions into various analytic categories. Significantly, race was the first category he listed, under which he wrote, "All my cases, 80 in number, are British and American, 20 living in the United States and the rest being British. Ancestry, from the point of view of race, was not made a matter of special investigation." He then listed the ancestries of the individuals whose case studies he included, which he identified as English, Scotch, Irish, German, French, Portuguese, and more or less Jewish. He concluded that, except in the apparently frequent presence of the German element, there is nothing remarkable in this ancestry. Ellis used the term race in this passage interchangeably with national origin, with the possible exception of Jewish identity. These national identities were perceived to be at least partially biological, and certainly hereditary in Ellis's account, though subordinate to the categories British and American. Although he dismissed ancestry, from the point of view of race, as a significant category, its place as the first topic within the chapter suggested its importance to the structure of Ellis's analysis. Ellis's ambiguous use of the term race was not unusual for scientific discourse during this period, in which it might refer to groupings based variously on geography, religion, class, or color. The use of the term to mean a division of people based on physical, rather than genealogical or national, differences had originated in the late 18th century, 1700s, when Johann Friedrich Blumenbach first classified human beings into 5 distinct groups in On the Natural Variety of Mankind. This work in turn became a model for the 19th century, 1800s, fascination with anthropometry, the measurement of the human body. Behind these anatomical measurements lay the assumption that the body was a legible text, with various keys or languages available for reading its symbolic codes. In the logic of biological determinism, the surface and interior of the individual body, rather than its social characteristics, such as language, behavior, or clothing, became the primary sites of its meaning. Every peculiarity of the body has probably some corresponding significance in the mind, and the causes of the former are the remoter causes of the latter, wrote Edward Drinker Cope, a well-known American paleontologist, summarizing the assumptions that fueled the science of comparative anatomy. Although scientists debated which particular anatomical features carried racial meanings, skin, facial angle, pelvis, skull, brain mass, genitalia, nevertheless, the theory that anatomy predicted intelligence and behavior remained remarkably constant. As Nancy Steppen and Sander Gilman have noted, the concepts within racial science were so congruent with social and political life, with power relations, that is, as to be virtually uncontested from inside the mainstream of science. Supported by the cultural authority of an ostensibly objective scientific method, these readings of the body became a powerful instrument for those seeking to justify the economic and political disenfranchisement of various racial groups within systems of slavery and colonialism. As Barbara Fields has noted, however, try as they would, the scientific racists of the past failed to discover any objective criterion upon which to classify people. To their chagrin, every criterion they tried varied more within so-called races than between them. Although the methods of science were considered to be outside the political and economic realm, in fact, as we know, these anatomical investigations, however professedly innocent their intentions, were driven by racial ideologies already firmly in place. Ideologies of race, of course, shaped and reflected both popular and scientific understandings of gender. As Gilman has argued, any attempt to establish that the races were inherently different rested to no little extent on the sexual difference of the black. Although popular racist mythology in the 19th century, 1800s, United States focused on the supposed difference between the size of African American and white men's genitalia, the male body was not necessarily the primary site of medical inquiry into racial difference. Instead, as a number of medical journals from this period demonstrate, comparative anatomists repeatedly located racial difference through the sexual characteristics of the female body. In exploring the influence of scientific studies of race on the emerging discourse of sexuality, it is useful to look closely at a study from the genre of comparative anatomy. In 1867, W. H. Flower and James Murray published an account of the dissection of a bushwoman, which carefully catalogued the various, more perishable soft structures of the body of a young bushwoman. They placed their study in a line of inquiry concerning the African woman's body that had begun at least a half-century earlier, when French naturalist Georges Cuvier's description of the woman popularly known as the Hottentot Venus, or Sardia Bartman, who was displayed to European audiences fascinated by her statopygia, protruding buttocks. Significantly, starting with Cuvier, this tradition of comparative anatomy located the boundaries of race through the sexual and reproductive anatomy of the African female body, ignoring altogether the problematic absence of male bodies from their study. Flower and Murray's account lingered on two specific sites of difference: the protuberance of the buttocks, so peculiar to the Bushman race, and the remarkable development of the labia minora, which were sufficiently well marked to distinguish these parts from those of any ordinary varieties of the human species. The racial difference of the African body, implied Flower and Murray, was located in its literal excess, a specifically sexual excess that placed her body outside the boundaries of the normal female. To support their conclusion, Flower and Murray included corroborating evidence in the final part of their account. They quoted a second-hand report received from a scientific friend residing at the Cape of Good Hope, describing the anatomy of two purebred Hottentots, mother and daughter. This account also focused on the women's genitalia, which they refer to as appendages. Although their account ostensibly foregrounded boundaries of race, their portrayal of the sexual characteristics of the bushwoman betrayed Flower and Murray's anxieties about gender boundaries. The characteristics singled out as peculiar to this race, the double appendages, fluttered between genders, at one moment masculine, at the next moment exaggeratedly feminine. Flower and Murray constructed the site of racial difference by marking the sexual and reproductive anatomy of the African woman as peculiar. In their characterization, sexual ambiguity delineated the boundaries of race. The techniques and logic of late 19th century 1800s sexologists, who also routinely included physical examinations in their accounts, reproduced the methodologies employed by comparative anatomists like Flower and Murray. Many of the case histories included in Krafft-Ebing's Psychopathia Sexualis, for instance, included a paragraph detailing any anatomical peculiarities of the body in question. Although Krafft-Ebing could not draw any conclusions about somatic indicators of abnormal sexuality, physical examinations remained a staple of the genre. In Ellis's Sexual Inversion, case studies often focused more intensely on the bodies of female inverts than those of their male counterparts. Although the specific sites of anatomical inspection, hymen, clitoris, labia, vagina, differed, the underlying theory remained constant. Women's genitalia and reproductive anatomy held a valuable and presumably visual key to ranking bodies according to norms of sexuality.